From sea to sea, the American nation now stretched, strong and free and vital. The land yielded steadily to the peaceful tools of production. But fires were burning beyond the national borders, which would sear into history's new page the next mission for the U.S. soldier. That mission took him away from his own land in the summer of 1898, across the water to Cuba, which was fighting for its independence from Spanish domination. The Spanish-American War was a short one. The soldier handled himself well. The world remembers the soldier of that war chiefly for his most significant and decisive battle, his dashing charge up San Juan Hill and nearby El Caney on the approach to Santiago on the first day of July. Victory in this war brought the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, as well as Cuba, into U.S. possession. And the United States would forever after be involved in the affairs of the world at large.
So we went through the Spanish-American War, and essentially we had about 10 batteries that were active out at Fort Hancock, and we had 6 companies of coast artillery. 6 companies was a lot of coast artillery out there compared to other installations throughout the United States. So there was a significant investment in Fort Hancock. Beginning in 1912, we began to see the tensions going on within Europe. So you had a lot of naval construction going on, but you had to be able to defend your naval bases, and we had a Navy yard and a Navy base in New York. So Fort Hancock took on a more important role of defending New York. Beginning about 1912, they started really looking at it, and in 1915, they realized they needed to change the defenses, and that's where you got the authorization to build batteries Kingman and Mills, which were much longer range batteries than previous construction, and they were also more expensive and larger. It isn't about one fort, it's about a group of fortifications. Fort Hancock, Fort Wadsworth, Fort Hamilton, Fort Tilden, Fort Totten, Fort Jay, we know as Governor's Island, Fort Schuyler. All of those forts formed the harbor defenses in New York. You essentially had the eastern harbor defenses, the southern harbor defenses, and then you had the harbor defenses of Sandy Hook. So the primary mission of the Coast Artillery was twofold: protect the industrial sites, protect the commercial harbor, and protect the Navy anchorages.
Now, Germany's emperor from 1897 to 1903 was Kaiser Wilhelm, and this guy really believed strongly that the militaristic state was the only really good state for government, and he made himself an admiral in his own navy. He not only hated what the West stood for, but he wanted also some significant power in the world, so he started wreaking havoc on the British Navy as well as others. He also wanted to reduce America's global influence during this period, so believe it or not, he planned an invasion of our country called Plan 3, which was supposed to stop our growing economic and political connections in the Pacific and the Caribbean and South America, and it was supposed to increase Germany's influence in those places. Now, he believed capitalism was extremely vulnerable, especially if he could cripple some of our international trade and credit and insurance and the whole financial picture of America. So the Kaiser's infamous Plan 3 was supposed to have 60 of Germany's ships carry 100,000 soldiers to shell New York City and capture Boston.
The East Coast is the heart of the United States, and this is where she is most vulnerable. New York will panic at the prospect of bombardment. By hitting her here, we can force America to negotiate.
A little ambitious for sure, and thankfully it was never attempted or realized. But Germany did continue to engage Britain in a war, and of course, before long, the United States declared war against Germany. It was the First World War, which would last from 1914 to 1918. And when the war ended, Americans believed the world would be at peace for a long time. But that would not be the case at all. Nevertheless, Americans celebrated the end of the war while Fort Hancock launched its blimp-like balloon in about 1919 and shot some stunning film of what Fort Hancock looked like in 1918. First, they're blowing up the balloon.
Private Kirk is a funny little codger with a smile, a funny smile. Like Eaton, he's an awful little dodger with a smile, a funny smile. The short road, he'll have his little show, he can't be so brave. All the other fellas have to grin when he gets this off his chest. Hey! Pack all your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
We came out of the First World War. Most of the nations of the world were broke. France had essentially, in the words of a famous person of the time, they lost the flower of their youth in the trenches of Verdun. And they did. They lost over 1.6 million of their men. The average European country only had a population of between 15 and 25 million. If you lose 1.5 million men out of your age 18 through 30 manhood, that's very significant. And all of the European nations suffered under that. The United States was alone in having actually very few losses. We had under 200,000 troops killed. So the United States entered the 1920s essentially much healthier than the rest of the world. The rest of the world owed a lot of debt. The Treaty of Versailles required the conquered powers of Germany and Austria to pay reparations to France and Britain. It was an onerous bill, and it helped contribute to a general world economic downturn that began right out of the First World War. Germany was broke, living miserably. Their follow-on government, when the Kaiser abdicated, the Weimar Republic fell apart, and we ended up getting Hitler in 1933.
Hat sich über der Bewegung ein schwarzer Schatten erhoben. Die SA hat so wenig als irgendeine andere Institution der Partei, die es wagen, sich an ihr zu versündigen.
We saw him rising in the late 1920s. England was broke, France was broke, France retrenched, decided to build a huge fortification system, a wall, so to speak, known as the Maginot Line, and the United States was watching all of this as we were thriving in the 1920s. And then the stock market crashed, first in 1928, and then Black Thursday in 1929, in October of 1929, took the wind out of the sails of our economy, and we went down. All during this time frame, the United States saw the threats growing, and each of our presidents understood the threat posed by the violent dictatorships in Europe and in the Far East, because we were watching Japan, and Japan was turning into a country that was not friendly to the rest of the world. And America had possessions throughout the Pacific, and we had alliances with people, commercial alliances through business procedures that we had to watch out for. So our presidents ensured that we had a Navy to do that. So we continued building cruisers and destroyers. The Army had a small budget, so the Army, instead of building, began studying. The United States was building 6 battleships and 6 battlecruisers with a brand new 16-inch gun called the Mark II, which actually turned out to be one of the best 16-inch guns ever made. The Navy canceled all 12 ships. And the Army suddenly became the benefactor of over 80 completed Mark II 16-inch gun tubes, and the Army took them over and began developing plans to emplace them. So coming out of the First World War, the United States Army decided, instead of having all these different kinds of guns, 3-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch, 14-inch, and then an early 16-inch gun, they would standardize essentially on 3 guns: the 16-inch Mark II, the 6-inch, which was a series of guns, M1905, M1900, M1903, and some 8-inch guns that were provided by the Navy in the 1920s, and everything else would eventually be replaced. Then we paused due to lack of money, Black Thursday, the Great Depression, and developed additional plans without doing any more construction until 1937.
Soon after World War I ended, the Army started to realize that airplanes could fly over and bomb New York, so we had anti-aircraft guns, and they were positioned all over Fort Hancock. There were a total of 4 mobile anti-aircraft batteries consisting of 2 3-inch guns.
Beginning around 1920, our entire philosophy for constructing defenses changed. Actually, we were thinking about it beginning in 1915, when we went to the long-range barbette carriages, which gave guns very high levels of elevation. We changed our strategy and decided that we would disperse the guns, so the batteries all of a sudden had a huge footprint. So you would have a 12-inch long-range battery that was as long as 9-gun with only 2 guns. And the theory was, the more you disperse it, the less likelihood of taking the entire battery out with one hit. Military bases like Fort Hancock don't really think about war, but what happens is senior leaders in the Army make decisions about various bases and how they're going to react to what our senior leadership sees as a threat. So Fort Hancock's purposes became multifaceted in terms of testing. So Fort Monmouth was nearby. Fort Monmouth was a Signal Corps laboratories, and they developed radios, telephones, radar, various different types of systems that they were responsible for to support the military, specifically the Army. So Fort Hancock became a testing ground for the Signal Corps for telephones, radar, radios, and various other components. So they were thinking forward to fighting a war by testing new equipment to see if it was suitable for use by the Army.
Bombers over New York as the eastern seaboard from Boston to Cape Hatteras gets a full week of make-believe attacks. Spotters atop the Empire State Building telephone information centers. Altogether, 40,000 civilian volunteers man 1,800 observation posts in 10 states. In New York parks, playgrounds, airports, and even at racetracks, camouflaged anti-aircraft guns are uncovered and manned in this most realistic of defense drills. River bridges have sky guns, and Easterners give thanks that over here, these are only mock raids. Back to the alarm. Flash messages from spotters have also gone to Army nerve centers, and orders are phoned to Army flying fields. Interceptor plane pilots race to their planes ready for sky combat. Down below is Fort Tilden, scene of a second part of the wide-scale defense tests. This fort is to be raided by a so-called Black Army made up of regular Army units. At midnight, the invasion begins. Invasion boats of all kinds bring 1,500 to the surprise raid.
With Nazi Germany's march on Poland in 1939, the threat of conflict burst into shattering reality. War of a dimension the world had never seen was introduced.
So for us, the threat began with the invasion of Poland. In the Pacific, we already knew the Japanese were a problem. They'd gone into Manchuria in 1931. We began mobilizing against Germany in the summer of 1940, and we began to refocus in the summer of 41 on Japan because of our problems and relationships with them. Japan moved into what then was known as French Indochina, Vietnam. In the summer of 1941, we issued trade embargoes on the Japanese, which were costing the Japanese the ability to operate in China. The Japanese attacked us in December 41.
Then came Pearl Harbor, and now America was committed, with its every resource, to seeing the grim war to its bitter end.
By January of 1941, we had 1.6 million men on active duty. The entire National Guard was called up. By January of 1942, we're at 3.5 million men on active duty. January of 1943, we're at 5.5 million men on active duty. January of 1944, we're at 9.5 million men on active duty. All total served in the Second World War, 16 million men were in uniform out of a total population of military-age men of 35 million. We put 1 out of every 2 men in uniform during the Second World War. That is essentially mobilizing your country. We had already been on alert at Fort Hancock for 5 months. The only thing that changed in the harbor defenses in New York in December of 1941 was we activated the New York-Philadelphia sector and transferred their troops over under tactical control from the 2nd Coast Artillery District, and we planted the minefield in New York Harbor. Concept for mining harbors goes back to the 1890s, and the term was called torpedoes. And what they really were was mines that we would put out into the water and we would control them from land. And this process evolved all the way into the late 1930s and the early 1940s. All of our major harbors had the capability to be mined. And there were 2 entities responsible for mining harbors, the Army and the Navy. And they both approached the process very differently. The Navy believed in using anchored contact mines. These anchored contact mines of the Navy were designed to be anchored to the ocean floor, but would float in such a way that a ship would run into them and cause the mine to detonate. The Army's view of a minefield was to control it, and their mines were control detonated. So you had a battery that was responsible for the mines. They would put the mines out into the channel, and then they would monitor them with fire control stations like a gun battery. And when a ship moved over the top of the minefield, if it was an enemy ship and they wanted to sink it, they would detonate one of these Army mines underneath the ship. The Army mines were about 4 times the size of Navy mines. Navy mines were between 250 and 500 pounds. The Army mines were 1,000 pounds and up. They were much larger. So the Army minefield was command controlled, which meant they chose when they were going to fire it. They could be set for contact, but they were normally command controlled. It was a more expensive, more intricate minefield, and at the end of the day, the Army's minefields normally were the ones that were used, and the Navy's mines often would break loose, and because they were contact mines, they would hit ships, often our own, and cause problems within our harbors. They had significant issues with this down in Chesapeake Bay.
Incidentally, batteries Urmston, Morris, Peck, and Gunnison, with their rapid-fire 3- and 6-inch guns, were all assigned to protect the minefield.
The Germans were in the harbor. They actually got U-boats into the outer area of the harbor right off of Fort Hancock. They planted mines in New York Harbor. They landed people in Long Island, down in Florida. And the German U-boats became more and more aggressive as the war went on, and they also began equipping them with very sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, to the point that not far out at sea from Fort Hancock in August of 1943, a German U-boat shot down 2 Navy PV-1 Ventura bombers from Floyd Bennett Field. So about 12 families didn't get to see their loved ones one evening. of did we fire on any German vessels? Not directly from Fort Hancock, but what we did do was fire on ships that were not obeying the harbor entrance control post and were not following the rules to come into the harbor. In fact, Battery Gunnison, we've documented 13 times that battery fired between September of 43 and September of 44. A number of those times were on Navy ships, but many of them were also on foreign flag vessels that were having trouble understanding their instructions. It was not uncommon to see ships burning out on the horizon, especially in 41 or 42, and especially 43. 42 and 43, it was not uncommon. In March of 1943, the Germans sunk 926,000 tons of shipping. Okay, the average ship weighed about 8 to 10,000 tons. That's approximately 115 ships. Of that 926,000 tons, about half of it was fuel tankers. The Exxon Valdez is a super tanker. The amount of oil that was released in that 1 month was the equivalent of essentially 2.5 Exxon Valdezes. That was serious enough over time where there were people washing their bathing trunks in the 1950s and early 60s and washing tar balls out of their bathing trunks down in Cape May and along the Jersey Shore.
Destruction lay in the wake of every victory won. The blood of heroes colored every mile of ground. Biting weariness and aching loneliness lay behind every statistic of success. But through city after city, the victorious soldier pushed on.
The wartime garrison that manned Fort Hancock essentially numbered about 5,000. Now, counting some of the numbers is a little difficult because there's a lot of reference to the combat troops, which were mostly all coast artillery, and less understanding of the structure of the support troops. But it appears there were about 1,000 support troops, so roughly 5,000 total assigned directly to Fort Hancock. But there was also a mobile combat component to the defenses of Fort Hancock, Sandy Hook, and the harbor defenses in New York, and that consisted of the 113th Regimental Combat Team and other ground combat units that were assigned to the area. So Fort Hancock was responsible for supporting over 7,000 troops because these troops were all up and down the Jersey coast and up into New York. And Fort Hancock was responsible for supporting all of those. All total, Fort Hancock was accountable for over 13,000 troops assigned to the harbor defenses in New York. But that covered a lot of forts: Tilden, Totten, Jay, Hamilton, Wadsworth, as well as the mobile troops throughout the highlands of New Jersey, the Jersey Shore, and southern New York.
On the other side of every liberated city lay the war again. Another battle to win. Another mile or another 20 to travel. Another day to fight. Through 3.5 years of Holocaust, the soldier moved in an agonizing but relentless march, pushing back the encroachments of aggression until the enemy finally lay crushed and defeated. How jubilant was the taste of victory. How sweet the rewards of peace. A bruised and suffering world stirred again to the triumphant strains of victory. For the soldier, it was the proud end of a long and arduous road.
Fort Hancock processed thousands of soldiers out of the Army. It was a final destination before they headed home. The Army, by 1949, had decided to get out of the harbor defense business. They turned it over to the Navy and the Coast Guard. They began turning over the weaponry that was at Fort Hancock to the Navy. The Navy wasn't particularly interested in it. A lot of it sat, like the 2 guns at Battery Gunnison, New Peck. Those guns sat all the way into the early 1960s. They were available for foreign military sales. No country was interested in purchasing one-of-a-kind weapons like those, so they sat. And in 1950, the Army closed Fort Hancock and told the Coast Guard, that had a small base out there, here's your piece of the real property. We're closing the rest of our functions until we figure out what we're going to do with the installation, which was in fact the rest of Sandy Hook Peninsula. The Coast Guard kind of panicked and said, wait a minute, we depend on you to support us for things like wastewater treatment and water pumping station and our school for our children and helping us with our subsistence, i.e. our food, our mess hall. We need your help, Army. And the Army kind of looked at him and shrugged, and then the Korean War hit. But what we were really concerned about in the Korean War was not the Korean conflict, but the Soviets. So a good hunk of our Army was focused on the Soviets, who were also quite belligerent in Europe, and we were concerned about airstrikes from Russia hitting the United States, specifically New York. So we began bringing National Guard anti-aircraft units on active duty, assigning them to Fort Hancock, and that was the precursor to the Nike mission that came out in the early 1950s as we stood Fort Hancock back up to answer an air threat.
You are authorized to proceed.
The decision is made. We strike back.
We had real-time invasions. We had a place in Texas that would fly a squadron of SAC bombers out over the Gulf of Mexico. They would fly up the East Coast, way out over the water, and then turn inbound to New York. We would not be alerted that it was happening.
Soviet Union used to fly this bomber up and down the east coast of the United States during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, the Bear bomber is a subsonic bomber. Top speed's about 550, 575 miles per hour. However, it's got a tremendous range. It can fly over 9,600 miles on one load of fuel.